So how exactly does a nation where 86% of its farmers operate on plots of land no larger than like 1.6 acres manage to feed a fifth of the entire human population?
It's a huge question.
Right. And not just feed them, but officially eradicate extreme poverty in the process. Because if you look at the sheer physics of modern agriculture.
Economies of scale.
Exactly. The massive combine harvesters, the vast, endless fields of the American Midwest. If you look at that, the Chinese agricultural landscape just shouldn't work. It's too fragmented.
Oh, absolutely.
It's just too small. And yet it is the bedrock of, honestly, the most rapid and consequential economic transformation in human history.
Yeah, it completely defies the standard models of development. I mean, when you look at almost any other developing nation that has tried to, modernize its agricultural sector, the transition is almost always accompanied by mass displacement.
Right.
You get the creation of these unmanageable urban mega slums and basically a complete collapse of rural social stability. But China charted this entirely different path.
They really did.
And they did it by fundamentally rewriting the rules of who controls the dirt beneath our feet.
Which is fascinating.
Yeah.
Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this comforting expectation of precision. Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows a jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, there it is, broken.
Yeah, a clean binary.
Exactly. We want macroeconomics to be exactly like that x-ray machine. We want to be able to look at a country's economic system, apply a clean label, point to the screen and say, that is capitalist, or, that is socialist.
Broken or not broken.
Right.
But when you step into the world of macroeconomics, especially regarding the global south, well, that x-ray machine is often fundamentally broken.
Yeah.
The diagnostic landscape is incredibly murky. If you try to force these rigid, 20th century Cold War categories onto the subject we're exploring today, you're just going to misdiagnose the entire situation.
Completely. And that is exactly why we are here today. Welcome to today's deep dive. I am thrilled you're joining us. We are taking this massive, incredibly dense, and really paradigm-shifting academic text. It's called Socialist Economic Development in the 21st Century by Alberto, Gabriele, and Elias Jabbour.
It's quite a read.
It really is. And we're going to extract the most crucial foundational insights from it just for you.
Yeah. Because
the authors of this text have done this exhaustive analysis of how nations are attempting to develop their productive forces without simply, copy-pasting the Western neoliberal model.
And their primary laboratory for this analysis is, of course, China. But to truly understand the Chinese model, the authors argue that you can't just start by looking at the high-tech factories in Shenzhen.
Right, or the financial districts in Shanghai.
Exactly. You have to start in the dirt. You have to start with the land question.
The land question. That is our sole mission today. We want to understand exactly how the Chinese state handled the ownership, the usage, and the taxation of their land over the last few decades.
It's the key to everything else.
It really is. We're going to explore how changing the rules of who gets to grow a surplus of wheat on a tiny plot of dirt in a rural province ultimately laid the architectural blueprint for an economic model that is currently reshaping the globe.
Yeah, because the premise here is that the land question is the absolute bedrock of a nation's political economy.
Right.
If you don't understand the mechanics of how a nation organizes its agriculture, how it treats its peasantry, and how it extracts surplus value from the soil,
then you can't possibly understand its industrial or technological ambition.
Exactly. You're flying blind.
So, to decode all of this, to help us read this incredibly complex economic x-ray without falling back on those lazy binary labels, we need to go back to the baseline.
We need to set the stage.
Yeah. We need to look at the landscape of rural China prior to 1978. Because the system they had in place at that time was essentially a direct inheritance from the traditional Soviet model of central planning. So let's unpack this. What did the daily reality of that system actually look like on the ground?
Well, before the reforms of the late 1970s, the Chinese agricultural landscape was organized entirely around the Danwei system, which we commonly refer to as communes.
Right, the communes.
Yeah. And this was an attempt at the total socialization of agricultural production. You didn't have independent family farms. You had these massive state-directed entities where thousands of peasants were organized into production brigades.
Wow, thousands.
Oh, yeah, massive scale. The collective owned the land, the collective owned the tools, and the state dictated exactly what crops would be planted, how much would be harvested, and crucially, where that harvest would go.
Okay, the text highlights a really specific paradox about this era that I think is super important for you listening to grasp. Because on one hand, the communes were highly egalitarian at the local level.
Very much so.
Everyone was fundamentally in the same boat, relying on the same work point system for their basic rations. And, to their credit, the communes did achieve their most baseline objective. Yeah. They managed a rudimentary level of industrialization, and they kept a massive, historically famine-prone population alive.
Which, honestly, achieving baseline survival in a country as vast and geographically challenging as China is a legitimate historical achievement. We shouldn't just dismiss that.
Fair point.
However, the system was plagued by profound structural stagnation. And the authors point out that this stagnation wasn't just a matter of bureaucratic inefficiency.
Right, it was deeper than that.
It was the result of a deliberate, systemic, anti-rural bias that the Chinese Communist Party had basically absorbed from early Soviet economic theory.
Okay, I really need you to break down the mechanics of that anti-rural bias, because politically, the Chinese Communist Party was brought to power in 1949 by a massive grassroots mobilization of the peasantry.
Right.
So it seems completely counterintuitive that they would then build an economic system structurally biased against the very people who put them in power.
It does seem strange, but it comes down to the grim mathematics of early industrialization.
Okay, how so?
Well, when you are an impoverished, newly established state and you look at the global landscape, you realize immediately that you need heavy industry to survive.
You need steel.
You need steel, you need electricity, infrastructure, and a military apparatus to defend yourself. And the Soviet model prioritized heavy, rapid urban industrialization above absolutely everything else.
But factories and steel mills require immense amounts of capital. So if you don't have foreign investors and you don't have domestic billionaires to tax, where does that initial capital come from?
It has to be extracted from the only resource you have.
Which is the land.
The land and the labor of the people working it. The state essentially treated the countryside as an internal colony to fund the cities.
Wow, an internal colony.
Yeah. They instituted a policy of primitive socialist accumulation, and the mechanism for this was a rigid dual-track pricing structure that deliberately violated what Marxist economists call the law of value.
Okay, let's pause and define the law of value clearly, because the text leans on it heavily. So, in classical Marxist economics, the value of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce it, right?
Correct.
And in a functioning market, prices generally fluctuate around that inherent value.
Yes. But under the commune system, the state artificially severed prices from value.
How did they do that?
The central planners imposed mandatory grain quotas on the communes. The state would purchase this grain at artificially depressed fixed prices.
Okay, so they buy it super cheap.
Exactly. Then they would take that cheap grain and use it to feed the urban industrial workers, effectively subsidizing the cost of industrial labor.
Right.
And at the same time, the state-owned factories would sell manufactured goods like tractors, fertilizers, basic consumer items back to the rural communes at artificially high prices.
So it was a price scissors.
Exactly, price scissors.
The state is underpaying the farmers for their output and overcharging them for their inputs. And the margin between those two manipulated prices is essentially the capital the state uses to build up the cities.
It was a massive structural transfer of wealth from the rural peasantry to the urban industrial core. And the devastating psychological and economic result of this is that it completely destroyed the material incentive for the farmer.
Well, yeah. I mean, if I'm a farmer in a production brigade, and I know that no matter how hard I work, the state is going to take the surplus at a fraction of its actual value.
Right.
And I'm just going to get my standard egalitarian ration of grain at the end of the month, why would I ever risk experimenting with a new crop? Why would I break my back working extra hours?
You wouldn't. I mean, the authors note that the extreme egalitarianism of the commune system actually ended up undermining the core socialist principle of distribution according to work.
Because if the hardest worker and the most unproductive worker receive the exact same compensation,
the rational response is to decrease your effort to match the lowest common denominator.
It's just human nature at that point.
Yeah, the system functionally suffocated its own productivity.
So by the late 1970s, this stagnation reaches a critical boiling point. The CCP leadership, particularly Deng Xiaoping, is looking beyond their borders. And they are seeing Japan rebuilding into an economic powerhouse.
Right.
They are seeing the Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, experiencing massive rapid economic booms based on export-oriented market models. Meanwhile, the Chinese countryside is barely producing enough to maintain its own caloric needs.
Yeah, Deng Xiaoping recognized a harsh political and economic reality. The rigid anti-market radicalism that had characterized the previous decades, events like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, had completely exhausted its historical usefulness.
Right.
The command economy was keeping the population at a level of subsistence, but it was actively preventing China from developing its productive forces or catching up technologically.
He understood that if the state just kept squeezing the rural piggy bank, the whole system would fracture. You couldn't just, tinker with the central plan. You had to fundamentally alter the social contract with the peasantry. But what I find so fascinating about this transition is that it didn't actually start as a grand top-down decree from Beijing. The spark happened locally out of sheer desperation.
Yeah, the book details the origins of this in Anhui province in 1978.
Right, Anhui.
Now, Anhui was historically prone to drought and severe poverty, and local farmers in a village called Shaogang were facing the very real prospect of starvation because the collective quotas were failing so miserably.
Literally starving.
Yes. So, out of pure desperation, a group of farming households secretly agreed to subdivide the commune's land among themselves.
Wow.
They agreed they would fulfill the state's mandatory grain quota, but anything they grew beyond that, they would keep for themselves to eat or sell.
But they were effectively breaking the foundational laws of the commune system. That was technically a massive political crime at the time.
Oh, it was highly illegal, very dangerous.
Yeah.
But local provincial officials, who were also desperate to prevent a famine on their watch, quietly decided to just, look the other way.
They just let it happen.
They let the experiment run, and the results were immediate and undeniable. The agricultural output of that single village exploded.
Amazing.
So when the central leadership in Beijing, under Deng Xiaoping, saw the data, they faced a critical choice. They could crush the illegal experiment to maintain ideological purity, or study it, formalize it, and use it to save the country.
And pragmatism won. They chose to formalize it, and this localized act of desperation was rolled out nationally as the Household Responsibility System, or the HRS.
Yes, the HRS.
This is the mechanism that changes everything. Under the HRS, the commune is dismantled as the primary unit of production. The basic unit of the rural economy reverts back to the individual family household.
And the design of the household responsibility system was really a masterclass in transitional economics.
How so?
Because the state didn't just abandon central planning overnight, they created a dual-track system. The state entered into a strict, binding contract with each individual farming household.
Okay.
The household was legally obligated to deliver a specific fixed quota of basic crops, usually grain, to the state at the traditional, low, state-mandated price.
So the state ensures that the urban workforce still gets fed, and the baseline stability of the country isn't compromised.
Exactly. You keep the baseline secure. But the revolutionary innovation was the second track. Once that state quota was met, the farmer was free to cultivate whatever they wanted on the rest of the land.
Right.
And critically, they were allowed to sell that surplus on the newly legalized open local markets at whatever price the market would bear, and they got to keep the profit.
The material incentive is restored.
Instantly.
But I want to pause here, because this is where the Western understanding of the Chinese land question usually goes completely off the rails.
Oh, absolutely.
When people hear that China dismantled the collective communes, returned to family farming, and allowed open markets for profit, the immediate assumption is that China simply capitulated to capitalism and privatized the agricultural sector.
And the text is incredibly explicit on this point. This was absolutely not privatization.
Right.
The authors use a very specific phrase to describe the household responsibility system: liberalization without privatization.
Liberalization without privatization.
Yes. The state completely decentralized the production process, but they never relinquished ultimate ownership of the land itself. The land was not sold to the peasants.
But if the farmers didn't own the land, how could they operate as independent producers? What was the actual legal mechanism there?
They were granted usage rights. The village collective, acting as a representative of the state, leased specific plots of land to individual households on long-term contracts.
Okay, so it's a lease.
Yeah, initially 15 years, later extended to 30 years or more. So the farmer had the right to use the land, to benefit from the fruits of their labor on that land, and to make day-to-day decisions about what to plant. But they did not hold the underlying deed.
Okay, let me try an analogy here. I want you to think of it like leasing a commercial storefront in a massive shopping mall.
I like that.
You don't own the concrete building, right? The mall owner, the state, owns the physical real estate.
Yeah.
But you sign a long-term lease, you invest your time setting up your specific shop, and if you figure out how to sell 1 million widgets, you get to keep the profit from those sales.
Yes.
You have every incentive to improve your business, but you can't tear the building down, and you can't sell the building to a rival developer.
That analogy perfectly captures the dynamic.
Yeah.
The state maintained the ultimate lever of macroeconomic control, which is property ownership, while utilizing the microeconomic efficiency of the profit motive.
Right.
And the authors frame this using the Marxist concept of reconstituting simple commodity production.
Right, simple commodity production. I know the text leans on that heavily, but the mechanics of it can be a bit opaque for those outside of Marxist theory. How does simple commodity production actually differ from real capitalism?
Well, simple commodity production is a mode of production that predates capitalism by centuries.
Okay.
It simply describes a system where independent producers, artisans, or in this case, family farmers, own their own tools and use their own personal or family labor to produce goods.
Right.
They then take those goods to a market to trade or sell. The goal is to acquire money to buy other goods they need to survive.
You make shoes, you sell them to buy bread.
Precisely. The defining characteristic of capitalism, however, requires two additional massive structural elements:
Which are?
a free market for land and a free market for labor. And under the household responsibility system, the state deliberately prevented the emergence of both.
I see. Because if there were a free market for land, a highly successful, ruthless farmer could just take the massive profits they made from selling surplus grain and start buying up the deeds to all the neighboring farms.
Exactly. They would become a monopolistic landlord.
Right.
And because there was no free market for labor, that same successful farmer couldn't hire a massive army of desperate, landless wage laborers to work their newly acquired mega farm.
Wow.
So the state explicitly blocked the concentration of private land ownership and the massive exploitation of hired agricultural labor that traditionally marks the violent early stages of capitalist agrarian development.
Liberalization without privatization.
Yeah.
You unleash the market to solve the stagnation of the communes, but you keep a structural ceiling in place to prevent the creation of an entrenched capitalist landlord class.
You got it.
So what actually happens when you apply this highly calibrated mechanism to hundreds of millions of people who have been starving for a material incentive for decades? What happens to the agricultural output?
Oh, it triggered a productivity boom of historical proportions. I mean, the state provided the incentive, and the peasantry responded with overwhelming force.
The numbers are wild.
The data in the text is extraordinary. By 1984, just 6 years after that initial Anhui experiment, China's national grain production hit a record 407.3 million tons.
407 million.
Yes. That is a 33.6% increase in basic caloric output across a nation of 1 billion people in roughly half a decade.
It's hard to even conceptualize a 33% jump in the food supply of a nation that size. It essentially pulled millions of people back from the precipice of malnutrition almost overnight.
Literally overnight in historical terms.
And that momentum became structural, right?
Yeah.
From 1978 all the way to 2018, agricultural GDP in China maintained an average growth rate of 4.5% every single year.
Yeah, but the nuance here is that the boom wasn't just about growing more of the same basic staples. The real economic engine of the household responsibility system was how it allowed farmers to completely diversify their output. Once a family met their state quota for low-margin crops like rice or wheat, they looked at the open market and realized where the actual profit margins were.
Right, if you want to get wealthy, you don't grow extra wheat. You pivot to high-value cash crops.
Exactly.
The text provides incredible statistics on this dietary and economic shift. Over that 40-year reform period, fruit production didn't just grow. It compounded 11.5% annually.
Yeah.
Dairy production grew by 9% annually. We see massive, sustained explosions in meat, fish, edible oils. The Chinese diet fundamentally transformed because the rural economy diversified.
And this diversification drastically increased the income of the average rural household. But, as with everything, it also triggered a massive structural challenge that usually breaks developing nations.
Right, the surplus labor issue.
Yes. When a society suddenly becomes vastly more efficient at farming, it requires significantly fewer human beings working in the fields to produce the same amount of food.
Makes sense.
So the household responsibility system essentially created a massive immediate surplus of rural labor.
The farmers got too good at their jobs, so millions of them were effectively out of work.
Pretty much.
And in the textbook model of industrialization, say, in 19th century England or 20th century Latin America, that surplus labor triggers a chaotic mass migration. Millions of unemployed peasants flood into the major urban centers looking for factory work.
Which inevitably leads to the creation of massive slums, extreme poverty, and severe political instability.
Right. So how did China intercept that massive demographic wave?
They absorbed that shock by utilizing one of the most unique institutional innovations in modern economic history. They created township and village enterprises, or TVEs.
TVEs, okay.
Instead of allowing the surplus labor to flood into Beijing or Shanghai, the state encouraged local villages and rural townships to build their own light industries.
Oh, wow.
They took the farmers who were no longer needed in the fields and put them to work in small, community-owned factories right there in the countryside.
Okay, let me challenge the actual macroeconomic impact of this, because when I read rural, community-owned light industry, I immediately picture, like, a small group of farmers pooling their money to buy a sewing machine to make basic textiles. Or maybe a small foundry making rakes and shovels for the local villages.
Right. Very quaint.
Yeah, it sounds socially beneficial, but how could highly localized rural collectives possibly become a dominant force in a national, let alone global industrial economy?
It is a totally valid skepticism, but you have to understand the specific macroeconomic void these TVEs were stepping into.
Okay.
The traditional Chinese economy at the time was dominated by massive state-owned enterprises, the SOEs. These were sluggish, bureaucratic behemoths focused entirely on heavy industry, steel, mining, chemicals.
Right.
They were integrated into the rigid central plant and were incredibly slow to react to consumer demand.
So the SOEs are building the tanks and the bridges, but nobody is making refrigerators or bicycles.
Exactly. The TVEs found an immense, completely untapped market for light consumer goods among the newly enriched rural peasantry. And because the TVEs were technically outside the formal state plan, they operated with ruthless flexibility. They didn't have to wait for a 5-year plan from Beijing to change their product line.
Right.
If the local village realized people wanted electric fans, the TVE bought the parts and started making electric fans the next week.
That's incredible.
Furthermore, because they were community-owned, they had incredible access to highly motivated, cheap local labor, and they could pool the localized capital generated by the agricultural boom.
And the profits generated by these TVEs didn't just enrich a single factory boss, did they?
No, absolutely not. The profits were inherently tied to the local collective. The township would reinvest the profits to buy better machinery, expand the factory, or, crucially, fund local social welfare projects like paving roads or building village schools.
You mentioned my skepticism about their scale earlier. The statistics the authors provide completely obliterated my assumptions.
They really do.
I mean, by 1997, these township and village enterprises, these rural collectives, were responsible for producing 40% of China's total industrial output.
Almost half of the industrial might of a rising superpower was coming from rural collectives.
It's mind-blowing.
And even more staggering, they produced 40% of China's total exports.
Okay, wait. How does a village collective transition into a global export powerhouse? That is a huge leap.
They scaled rapidly by reinvesting their profits, forming joint ventures with foreign capital that was eager to access their cheap labor, and ruthlessly adapting to global market signals.
Okay.
Consider the appliance manufacturer Hair, or Galanz.
I've heard of Hair.
Yeah, Galanz started in the late 1970s as a rural cooperative in Guangdong province trading duck feathers.
Duck feathers.
Duck feathers. They saw a market opportunity, pivoted to textiles, and then eventually pivoted to home appliances. By utilizing the flexibility of the TVE structure, their access to cheap labor, and eventually engaging with global supply chains, Galanz grew to the point where they controlled roughly 33% of the entire global microwave market.
Are you serious?
A third of the world's microwaves were originating from what started as a rural collective absorbing surplus farming labor.
It's just a breathtaking economic achievement. You have the agricultural boom enriching the farmers, the surplus labor driving this massive flexible waves of light industrialization through the TVEs, and the country is modernizing at breakneck speed. I mean, it reads like an unmitigated economic miracle.
It was a period of unprecedented wealth creation, no doubt. But, Marxist analysis is fundamentally dialectical.
Meaning?
It recognizes that every solution inevitably generates its own new set of contradictions.
Oh, right.
As China moved into the late 1990s and early 2000s, the environment began to shift. The TVEs started facing intense competition from private domestic firms and foreign multinationals.
Makes sense.
More importantly, as the massive coastal cities began to physically expand outward to accommodate this economic explosion, a deeply painful and traumatic chapter opened for the Chinese farmer.
The authors referred to this period as the era of the peasant burden. And to understand it, we have to look at the hidden systemic cost of what we praised earlier.
Right.
The dismantling of the traditional communes.
Yes. We established that the communes were economically suffocating in terms of agricultural output, but they served a secondary function that was absolutely critical.
Which was?
They were the totalizing infrastructure of the rural social safety net.
Oh, wow, right.
The commune wasn't just a farm. It was the entity that funded the barefoot doctors running the local health clinics.
Right.
It paid the teachers at the village school. It provided a basic pension system for the elderly who could no longer work the fields.
So when the state instituted the household responsibility system and the massive commune was legally dissolved into millions of individual family lease agreements, that entire institutional safety net just evaporated.
It vanished almost overnight. The state essentially withdrew from providing rural public goods.
Why would they do that?
The logic was that the newly enriched farmers could simply purchase health care and education on the private market.
Right.
But the reality was that while average incomes had risen, the peasantry was suddenly incredibly vulnerable to systemic shocks. If a crop failed or if a family member required serious medical treatment, there was no longer a collective structure to absorb the blow.
That's terrifying.
Yeah, a single medical emergency could plunge a prosperous farming family back into absolute destitution.
And that profound vulnerability is compounded by an even larger macroeconomic crisis driven by the physical expansion of the cities. The text describes this as an epidemic of expropriation.
It really was.
And this is where the nuance of liberalization without privatization becomes incredibly dangerous for the farmer.
Exactly. Remember the core legal mechanic we discussed earlier?
The state retains ownership.
Right. The state, specifically the local municipal and provincial governments, retained ultimate legal ownership of the land. The farmers only held the usage rights.
So what happens when a city like Shenzhen or Guangzhou is experiencing double-digit economic growth and desperately needs to build a new subway system or a massive new industrial park or high-rise apartment complexes?
They have to build them somewhere.
Right. They have to expand into the surrounding rural farmland.
And here we must examine the bureaucratic mechanics of why local governments became so aggressive with this. In 1994, the central government in Beijing implemented a massive sweeping tax reform.
Okay, what did the reform do?
Prior to 1994, local governments kept a large portion of the tax revenue they generated. The 1994 reform highly centralized tax collection. Beijing took the lion's share of the revenue, but critically, they left the responsibility for funding local public services and infrastructure squarely on the shoulders of the local municipal governments.
Oh, wow. So the local mayor is told, you have to build a new highway, a new power grid, and 10 new schools to support this economic boom. But Beijing is taking most of your tax revenue.
Exactly.
Where does the mayor get the money?
The only asset the local government still controlled was the land.
Ah.
Because the state owned the land, local municipalities had the legal authority to simply cancel the usage rights of the local farmers, expropriate the farmland, rezone it for commercial or industrial use, and lease it to aggressive real estate developers for an astronomical profit.
Wow.
Land sales became the primary engine of municipal finance in China.
And what happens to the farmers who hold the usage rights to that land?
They are swept aside. Because they didn't hold the underlying deed, the compensation they received for losing their ancestral livelihoods was, as the authors document, grossly inadequate.
How inadequate are we talking?
Well, a local government might pay a farmer a minor administrative fee based on the agricultural value of the land, and then immediately turn around and lease that exact same land to a developer for 50 times that amount based on its new commercial value.
The scale of this displacement is staggering. I mean, the text estimates that by 2006, roughly 70 million Chinese farmers had lost their land to expropriation.
70 million.
70 million people. You're looking at the entire population of France, stripped of their primary means of production, handed a meager payout, and forced into the margins of expanding urban centers without any structural social safety net to catch them.
It was devastating. And for the hundreds of millions of farmers who managed to keep their land, the situation wasn't much better. This is the core of the peasant burden.
Okay.
Those cash-strapped local municipalities, desperate for any revenue they could find, began levying excessive, arbitrary, and highly predatory administrative fees and taxes directly on rural households.
For what?
Everything. You had local officials charging farmers exorbitant fees for road maintenance, for birth control planning, for school construction, for literally anything they could justify.
If we zoom out, the macroeconomic reality of the early 2000s is deeply contradictory, because the Chinese Communist Party, an institution that derives its fundamental historical legitimacy from an unbreakable alliance with the peasant class.
Right.
They are presiding over a system where local governments are aggressively stripping the peasantry of their land, taxing them into poverty, and leaving them without basic health care.
It was a massive crisis of transition. The friction of moving from a planned dual-price system to a highly aggressive market-mediated economy was generating immense heat, and the rural population was being burned.
Yeah.
The author stressed that this wasn't just a moral failing, it was an existential threat to the state.
How so?
If the CCP allowed this dynamic to continue unchecked, they risked creating a massive, structurally permanent, landless underclass. This is the exact dynamic that has plagued the development models of many nations in Latin America and India, leading to entrenched inequality, massive urban slums, and perpetual political instability.
Right. So faced with thousands of localized rural protests, rising social unrest, and the very real threat of destabilizing the entire national project, the central leadership in Beijing realizes that they cannot act like a Western capitalist state.
They can't just ignore it.
No. They cannot just sit back, let the market forces dictate the outcome, and hope the wealth eventually trickles down. They have to intervene, and they have to use the full weight of the state to do it.
And they did. The central government struck back against this crisis with a series of massive, highly targeted policy interventions.
Yeah.
And the most significant political signal of this new era arrived in 2004, when Beijing completely abolished all agricultural taxes on peasant production.
They didn't just lower the taxes. They entirely eliminated a tax system that had been extracting wealth from the peasantry for over 2,000 years of Chinese history.
It was an unprecedented, monumental shift in the political economy.
Wow.
By eliminating the agricultural tax, the central government instantly crushed the predatory local fee structures that were driving the peasant burden. It sent an unambiguous macroeconomic message. The era of primitive socialist accumulation is over.
No more piggy bank.
Exactly. The state will no longer extract wealth from the countryside to subsidize the cities. From this point forward, the state is prioritizing rural stability, rural income growth, and the protection of the peasantry.
But abolishing taxes only stops the bleeding, right? It doesn't heal the wound. If you don't have to pay taxes, that's great. But you still don't have a hospital to go to when you get sick because the commune system that used to build the hospitals is long gone.
Which is exactly why the tax abolition was only the first step. The state recognized that the free market was completely incapable of providing adequate, affordable social services to highly dispersed, relatively poor rural populations. There was no profit incentive for a private corporation to build a hospital in a remote village. Therefore, the state had to systematically rebuild the rural safety net that was lost during the reforms of the 1980s.
And the data the text provides on the scale of this institutional rebuilding is phenomenal. Let's look specifically at rural healthcare. In 2008, as the state began rolling out the new Rural Cooperative Medical Scheme, there were roughly 9,500 cooperative medical centers operating in the countryside.
Okay.
By 2013, just 5 years later, that number had exploded to over 38,000.
They quadrupled the physical infrastructure of rural healthcare in half a decade.
Unbelievable.
And they heavily subsidized the premium so that even the poorest farmers could participate. But they didn't stop at healthcare. They rolled out a new rural social pension scheme, fundamentally shifting the burden of elder care away from the individual family and onto the state.
Huge.
They instituted minimum wage laws that specifically protected rural migrant workers in the cities. They engaged in a massive systematic project of state-directed social engineering.
And all of these highly targeted, state-funded interventions culminate in a national achievement that the authors argue is the defining triumph of this system. By November 2020, the Chinese government officially declared that it had eradicated extreme poverty across the entire nation.
The eradication of extreme poverty is perhaps the most heavily scrutinized and debated economic milestone of the 21st century.
For sure.
But the mechanics of how China achieved it are undeniable. It wasn't accomplished through passive wealth distribution or simple cash handouts. It was a hyper-targeted, multidimensional campaign.
What does that look like on the ground?
The state identified the most vulnerable, geographically isolated rural populations, the exact people who had been bypassed by the urban market boom, and deployed millions of party cadres to address their specific deficiencies.
Okay.
If a village was impoverished because it lacked a paved road to the market, the state built the road. If families were living in unsafe, structurally unsound housing on mountainsides, the state physically relocated entire communities to newly built housing with running water and electricity.
I want to make sure the profound contrast here lands with the listener. Because over the last 40 years, much of the Western world has accepted a political consensus that favors austerity, the privatization of public utilities, and a steady, managed decline of the social safety net.
Absolutely.
We are repeatedly told that state intervention is inherently inefficient. But this text argues that when China faced a massive systemic crisis of inequality generated by its own market reforms, it did not retreat.
No.
It recognized the crisis and utilized the immense centralized power of the state to aggressively construct what the authors call a welfare state with Chinese characteristics. They engineered a floor beneath which their citizens would simply not be allowed to fall.
They understood that market forces, left entirely to their own logic, will eventually consume the social fabric required to sustain them. The state had to actively domesticate the market to ensure social survival.
However, fixing the social crisis, building the clinics, eliminating the predatory taxes, providing the pensions, that solves a humanitarian issue. It doesn't solve the core structural economic problem of the land itself. Because as we move deeper into the 21st century, Chinese agriculture faces a terrifying physical bottleneck.
This is the microfarm dilemma.
Let's lay out the parameters of this dilemma because the physics of it seem impossible.
Yeah.
In 2013, 86% of all Chinese farmers were operating on plots of land that were no larger than 1.6 acres.
Tiny.
To give you some context, the average size of a commercial farm in the United States is roughly 441 acres. Furthermore, China only possesses about 12.6% of the world's total arable land, but it is responsible for feeding nearly 18% of the global population.
The math is brutal.
Yeah.
You cannot achieve global food security on a 1.6-acre plot. You cannot deploy massive combine harvesters, you cannot utilize advanced drone-based pesticide spraying, and you cannot implement large-scale precision irrigation networks when a single valley is divided into thousands of tiny individual leases.
Right.
The household responsibility system, the very mechanism that sparked the economic miracle in the 1980s, had become the primary structural barrier to modernization in the 2000s. The land was too fragmented. They had to find a way to consolidate it to achieve the necessary economies of scale.
But hold on, the foundational rule of everything we've discussed so far is that the state owns the land. Liberalization without privatization. You cannot consolidate land in China the way you do in America.
Right, you can't just buy it up.
In the U.S., a massive agribusiness corporation simply comes in with $1 billion, buys up the deeds from hundreds of struggling family farmers, kicks them off the land, and creates a 10,000-acre mega farm. If the Chinese farmers only hold non-transferable usage rights, how can you legally consolidate the land to scale up farming without violating the core socialist principle of state ownership?
This challenge required another brilliant stroke of institutional innovation. The state recognized that the legal framework of the 1980s was obsolete, so they engineered a workaround.
What was the workaround?
The authors highlight a crucial piece of legislation, the 2007 law on specialized farmers' cooperatives.
Okay.
The state maintained that the underlying physical land could never be bought or sold. However, the 2007 law introduced a new mechanic. It allowed individual farmers to legally transfer or sublease their usage rights to third parties.
Oh. So, using our mall analogy, I still don't own the building.
Yeah.
But the state now allows me to take the lease I hold for my small storefront and legally sublease the operational rights of that space to a massive retail conglomerate.
Exactly. That's a perfect way to put it. The law allowed individual farming households to voluntarily pool their usage rights together, effectively transferring the operational control of their land to larger, newly formed agricultural cooperatives, or to what the government designates as leading agro-industrial enterprises.
Okay, the book provides a deeply illuminating case study of how this actually plays out on the ground. A place called Yaobang Village. The authors detail how, under this new legal framework, the residents of Yaobang held a massive community vote. All 488 individual households in the village unanimously voted to pool and transfer 100% of their land usage rights to a single-scale farming corporate entity.
Let's examine the mechanics of what happens in Yaobang, because it really is the blueprint for modern Chinese agriculture.
Let's do it.
By pooling the usage rights of 488 families, they instantly transformed thousands of fragmented, inefficient microplots into a single, contiguous, 172-hectare mega farm.
Which changes everything.
It does. Now, you have the scale necessary to bring in heavy machinery, implement scientific crop rotation, and drastically increase yields.
But wait, what happens to the 488 families? Because in a capitalist system, they just take a one-time buyout, lose their land forever, and have to move to the south to find work.
That is the crucial difference. Under this cooperative model, the families are not permanently displaced.
Okay.
First, they retain the ultimate claim to their usage rights. They are merely leasing them to the cooperative, which means they receive a steady, guaranteed stream of rental income regardless of the harvest.
Passive income.
Exactly. Second, many of those exact same farmers are immediately hired back by the cooperative as salaried agricultural workers, meaning they earn a wage on top of their rental income.
Okay.
And third, because the mechanized farm requires far less human labor overall, a significant portion of the village population is freed up entirely to seek much higher paying jobs in the modernized TVEs or the nearby urban tech centers, while still receiving that passive income from their village land.
It is a phenomenal legal pivot. You achieve the massive scale and efficiency of modern corporate agribusiness, but the underlying property rights remain locked within the public domain, and the local peasantry captures a significant share of the wealth generated by the consolidation.
Right.
But there's a massive missing piece here. Consolidating the land is just paperwork. Actually running a hyper-modern 172-hectare farm requires an astronomical amount of capital.
Oh, absolutely.
Tractors, advanced drones, automated irrigation systems, genetically modified seeds, none of that is cheap. If these aren't traditional private corporations backed by Wall Street venture capital, where is the money coming from to fund this modernization?
The capital comes from the state. The Chinese state acts as the ultimate financier, the ultimate risk absorber, and the ultimate driver of this agricultural modernization.
All right.
Because the state maintains absolute control over the macroeconomic levers of the country, specifically its massive publicly owned banking system, it can direct tsunamis of capital towards strategic national goals rather than just chasing the highest short-term quarterly return.
And the sheer volume of capital they are injecting into the dirt is staggering. The text notes that in 2016 alone, direct financial support and state subsidies to the agricultural sector exceeded $216 billion.
216 billion.
China has rapidly transformed into one of the most heavily subsidized, state-directed agricultural sectors on the planet.
And we have to look at exactly how that $216 billion is being deployed. It isn't just going toward simple price floors to keep farmers afloat.
What's it doing?
It is being aggressively funneled into cutting-edge modernization. The authors detail how the state has constructed the largest, most well-funded agricultural research and development system in the world. They are pouring billions into advanced biotechnology.
Like the development of bright cotton. The text mentioned how state scientists developed this genetically modified strain of cotton that naturally produces a protein toxic to certain pests.
Yes.
Which drastically reduces the need for chemical pesticides, lowers costs for the cooperative farms, and massively increases yields.
Precisely. They are also funding vast, technologically sophisticated irrigation networks. The state has subsidized irrigation infrastructure to the point where it now covers well over half of the country's total arable land, a rate that vastly exceeds the global average.
Wow.
The state identifies a strategic bottleneck: lack of water, pests, lack of scale, and uses its massive financial weight to engineer a solution.
So what we are looking at in the Chinese countryside today is this hybrid beast. It is a hyper-modern, intensely subsidized, state-directed, yet simultaneously market-oriented agricultural sector.
Very much so.
The individual farmers and the massive cooperatives are competing for profits, they are responding to global price signals, and they are ruthlessly pursuing efficiency. But the state owns the underlying land. The state provides the massive capital injections, the state funds the fundamental R&D, and the state dictates the overarching long-term strategic goals.
And that reality, that highly engineered synthesis of state control and market dynamism, is the perfect gateway to understand the broader macroeconomic argument of this book.
Right.
Because this modern Chinese farm we just spent an hour dissecting, The authors argue it is not an isolated anomaly. It is the absolute perfect microcosm for China's entire socioeconomic system. It encapsulates the very definition of market socialism.
Let's zoom out and look at the big picture then. The core thesis of socialist economic development in the 21st century is that this specific architectural blueprint retaining ultimate state ownership over the commanding heights of the economy while utilizing market mechanisms to drive productivity is the defining characteristic of the Chinese model.
The authors contend that what we've mapped out in the agricultural sector is directly mirrored in the industrial, technological, and financial sectors. This brings us to a foundational concept in the text: the role of the state, not just as a regulator, but as the entrepreneur-in-chief.
Okay, I really need to understand the mechanics of how that actually differs from a Western capitalist model. Because, Western governments subsidize things too.
Sure.
The U.S. government gives massive subsidies to its agricultural sector and its tech companies. So how is the Chinese state acting differently?
In a traditional Western capitalist paradigm, the state is fundamentally conceived as a referee or a night watchman. The state sets the basic legal framework, enforces property rights, and then largely steps off the field. The allocation of capital and the direction of the economy are left entirely to the private market.
Right.
The state only steps back onto the field to intervene during massive systemic market failures, like a recession, a banking collapse, or a global pandemic, and usually only to socialize the losses of private corporations.
But the Chinese state refuses to wait on the sidelines.
Exactly. In the Chinese model, the state is the most powerful, active player on the field. It refuses to cede the strategic direction of the economy to the chaotic whims of private capital.
And how do they exert that power?
The primary mechanism they use is the state-owned enterprise, the SOE, specifically the massive conglomerates managed by an entity called SASAC.
SASAC, the State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle that honestly often gets overlooked in Western analysis. Explain what SASAC actually is and how it functions.
SASAC is essentially the largest holding company on the planet. It is a special commission directly under the State Council of China, and it acts as the legal representative of the state's ownership in the largest, most strategically vital corporations in the country.
Like what kind of corporations?
We are talking about the massive entities that control telecommunications, aerospace, energy grids, heavy manufacturing, and the massive state-owned banks.
The big stuff.
The biggest. SASAC appoints the top executives of these corporations, it approves their mergers, and most importantly, it ensures that these massive entities are aligning their corporate strategies with the long-term developmental goals of the Chinese Communist Party.
So while these giant SAS-controlled companies might compete with each other for market share, and while they might operate globally to generate profit, their ultimate directive isn't simply to maximize the quarterly dividend for private shareholders.
No.
Their directive is to execute the state's macroeconomic vision.
Exactly. The authors call this market-compatible planning. They aren't trying to micromanage the price of every single screw or bushel of wheat like the old Soviet planners tried and failed to do.
Right.
Instead, they use entities like SAS and the state-owned banking system to seize the commanding heights of the economy. They control the flow of massive capital, they control the fundamental infrastructure, and they use that immense weight to shape the terrain that the private market operates on.
Let me try a metaphor to crystallize this, because the mechanics are so different from what we're used to in the West.
Go for it.
If we imagine a purely free market capitalist economy as a wild, untamed river, it carves its own path, it flows wherever gravity and the terrain take it, it generates immense raw power, but occasionally it floods and completely destroys the towns built along its banks.
A very apt description of unregulated market cycles.
Right. And if we look at the old pre-1978 Soviet central planning model, it was essentially the state trying to carry all of that water from the mountains to the ocean using millions of tiny, strictly rationed buckets. It was exhausting, inefficient, and ultimately doomed to stagnate. The Chinese market socialist model, as described in this text, is the equivalent of building a massive, highly engineered, structurally robust hydroelectric dam.
I think that captures the dynamic perfectly.
They aren't fighting the water. They are actively harnessing the raw, undeniable, chaotic power of the river, the market forces, the profit motive, the ruthless drive for efficiency.
Yes.
But they have constructed this massive structural dam-retaining state ownership of the land, controlling the banking system, utilizing SAF to guide the megacorporations, to strictly control where that water flows, how fast it is allowed to move, and ultimately they decide who gets the electricity that is generated.
And that precise capability, the ability to harness the market while subordinating it to long-term state-directed goals, is leading China toward what the authors identify as an entirely new higher stage of socioeconomic development.
What's that called?
They term this the new project economy.
The new project economy. That sounds like a massive paradigm shift. What exactly makes it new, and how does it differ from the system that built the TVEs or eradicated poverty?
It is the culmination of decades of capacity building. The authors argue that the Chinese state has developed such immense, unprecedented capacity to process macroeconomic data, coordinate impossibly complex long-term projects, and direct capital through its public banking system that it is no longer entirely beholden to the strict dictates of short-term market profitability.
Meaning the state can choose to fund things that a private venture capitalist would look at and say, that will never turn a profit in 5 years, so we aren't funding it.
Exactly. In a strictly capitalist system, capital naturally flows toward the path of least resistance and highest immediate return, often software apps, financial speculation, or consumer debt.
Right.
But the Chinese state, acting as entrepreneur-in-chief, can deploy massive capital toward goals that might take decades to mature, or that might never be strictly profitable in a narrow financial sense, but are absolutely essential for human survival and national advancement.
Give me a concrete example of the new project economy in action today.
Look at the high-speed rail network, or the massive investments in ultra-high voltage electricity transmission, or the aggressive pivot toward green energy and ecological sustainability.
Okay.
A private corporation is never going to build a high-speed rail line to a remote, impoverished Western province because the ticket sales will never cover the multi-billion-dollar construction cost. It is a bad capitalist investment.
Makes sense.
But the Chinese state builds it anyway because the goal isn't ticket revenue. The goal is integrating that remote province into the national economy, lifting its population out of poverty and ensuring long-term social stability. They are using the immense wealth generated by the market to slowly emancipate society from the tyranny of short-term profit.
They are using the hydroelectric dam to power projects that the river would never naturally flow toward. Which, frankly, brings us to the end of this incredibly dense, fascinating journey. We started with a very specific mission: to understand the Chinese diagnostic X-ray through the lens of the land question.
And what a journey it was.
It was a masterclass in macroeconomic evolution. We traced the arc from the stagnant, rigidly egalitarian communes of the Soviet era, where the state treated the rural peasantry as an internal colony to extract capital for urban heavy industry.
We saw how the law of value was suppressed, destroying the incentive to produce.
We witnessed the desperate start of the Anhui experiment, which forced the state to adopt the brilliant, pragmatic compromise of the household responsibility system: liberalization without privatization, reconstituting simple commodity production by giving farmers the profit motive through usage rights, while the state maintained its iron grip on the ultimate ownership of the land.
Right. And we watched that single calibrated policy shift ignite a massive world historic agricultural productivity boom, which in turn generated the massive surplus of rural labor that fueled the incredible rise of the township and village enterprises.
We saw how rural collectives like Hare and Galance utilized their flexibility to conquer global supply chains.
But we didn't shy away from the trauma either. We explored the devastating collapse of the rural social safety net and the dark era of the peasant burden. We examined the systemic mechanics of the 1994 tax reforms, which forced desperate local governments to exploit their ownership of the land,
Leading to the expropriation and displacement of 70 million farmers to fuel an urban real estate boom.
We then saw the central state strike back against that crisis to protect its political legitimacy. They abolished the 2,000-year-old agricultural tax in 2004, systematically utilized state subsidies to rebuild the rural cooperative healthcare and pension systems, and launched the hyper-targeted, multidimensional campaign that officially eradicated extreme poverty by 2020.
And finally, we arrived at the highly engineered reality of the modern era: The 2007 laws that allowed farmers to pool their usage rights, enabling massive, heavily subsidized, hyper-technological cooperative mega-farms to achieve the economies of scale necessary to feed a fifth of humanity on just 12% of the world's arable land.
The ultimate microcosm of market socialism.
SASAC and the new project economy.
It is a profoundly complex dialectical story. It is a story of constant institutional innovation, of making devastating mistakes, and of utilizing the massive centralized power of the state to correct those mistakes and aggressively guide market forces toward long-term national goals.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, highly provocative thought to mull over. Something that builds on everything we've explored today about the fundamental nature of land ownership. Because the text makes a compelling, inescapable argument that keeping the ultimate ownership of the land locked in the hands of the state, while undeniably painful and chaotic during the expropriation era, ultimately prevented the creation of the massive, permanent, unmanageable mega-slums that have crippled the development of so many other nations.
By retaining ownership, the state maintained the ultimate macroeconomic lever of control. They prevented the rise of a monopolistic landlord class.
Exactly. And as we look forward into the incredible uncertain future of the 21st century, as the global population continues to rapidly expand, and as the accelerating impacts of climate change threaten the world's incredibly fragile, diminishing supply of arable land, it forces you to ask a very uncomfortable question about our own models. We are moving deep into the Anthropocene, an era defined by overwhelming human impact on planetary systems. In the long run, as resources become scarcer, is treating land as a heavily regulated public utility subject to long-term ecological state-directed planning, rather than treating it as a purely private financial asset to be bought, sold, and depleted by the highest bidder. Is that going to transition from being a uniquely Chinese socialist experiment into a baseline global necessity for human survival?
It fundamentally challenges us to consider what kind of economic X-ray, what kind of structural dam we will need to survive the challenges of the next 100 years.
The clear, rigid binary diagnoses of the Cold War simply will not cut it anymore. We have to look deeper. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly dense deep dive. Keep questioning the fundamental rules of the world around you. Keep looking beneath the surface of the soil, and we will see you next time.